The 4-foot cheater bar bent like a fishing rod. Two young mechanics hung their full weight on it, grunting as they tried to turn the crankshaft. The engine didn't budge. Not a micron. They dropped the pipe into the mud, wiping their hands as if the machine had insulted them personally. "Seized solid," one said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "Water in the cylinders. This thing's a boat anchor." The auctioneer's laugh crackled through the PA system. "You hear that, folks? 12 cents a pound. Scrap weight only. Who wants to haul off some expensive yard art?" The rain hammered down on the rusted yellow iron. The veteran stood apart from the crowd, hands buried deep in a canvas jacket. In his pocket was $400, his heating oil fund for November. He was about to bet it all on a casting code that shouldn't exist. The young guys saw a carcass. He saw a birth defect. They thought the machine was dead. He knew it was just waiting for the one man who remembered how it was born. If you spend enough time around dying machinery, you learn the smell of a farm auction. It is a mix of wet straw, stale coffee, and the sharp, acidic scent of oxidized gear oil. It is the smell of failure. The rain had turned the lot into a slurry of brown clay, sucking at the boots of the men who walked the rows. They were looking for bargains, for things they could polish and flip. The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic hammer, pounding down the value of everything in sight. He was selling off a legacy, piece by piece, to men who only cared about resale value. But when he got to lot 42, the rhythm changed. It became a joke. The D2 sat low in the mud, its pony motor missing, its main stack capped with a rusted soup can. "Do I hear 300?" the auctioneer shouted, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Come on, boys. The scrap weight alone is worth that. She's locked up tighter than a bank vault, but the tracks are good." The crowd rippled with amusement. A few of the younger guys, parts changers from the local dealership, had already looked it over. They had their bright plastic flashlights and their clean coveralls. Two of them had even tried a cheater bar earlier. The veteran had watched them from a distance. They had hooked a 4-foot pipe to the crankshaft nut and hung their entire weight on it. The bolt had groaned, threatening to snap, but the engine hadn't budged a micron. They had tossed the pipe down in the mud, wiping their hands as if the machine had insulted them personally. "Frozen," they said. "Water in the cylinders. Rusted solid." They were confident. They had the arrogance of men who have never had to build a machine, only replace parts until the computer clears the code. They looked at the rust and saw the end of the line. But the veteran, standing back by the bed of his truck, saw something else. He saw the specific curvature of the intake manifold. He saw the foundry mark stamped near the bell housing, a small, diamond-shaped symbol that meant this block was poured in Peoria, not the subsidiary plant. He walked forward slowly, his boots sinking into the slurry. The crowd parted, mostly to let the old fool get a closer look at the junk. He didn't look at the obvious things. He didn't check the oil. Oil in a machine this old is just a history of neglect. He didn't look at the coolant. There probably wasn't any. Instead, he reached out and laid a gloved hand on the cylinder head. The iron was cold, colder than the air. He closed his eyes for a second, ignoring the auctioneer's patter. He was listening to the silence. A truly seized engine, one that has torn itself apart internally, feels chaotic even when it is still. There is a jaggedness to the vibration when you strike it. But this engine felt dense. It felt uniform. It felt like a single, solid block of tension. He moved his hand down to the inspection plate. The bolts were undisturbed, covered in a layer of grime that hadn't been touched since the Johnson administration. That was the first clue. If a rod had let go, someone would have opened it up to look. If a bearing had spun, the pan would have been dropped. But this engine was sealed. It had simply stopped one day and never started again. The veteran knew why. He remembered the shift reports from late 1957. He remembered the memo about the Ni-Resist cylinder liners, a high-nickel alloy intended for export models to resist corrosion in tropical climates. It was a brilliant engineering solution that had one fatal flaw. Nickel expands and contracts at a different rate than cast iron. If you ran the engine hard and shut it down hot on a freezing day, the liner would contract faster than the piston inside it. It wouldn't rust. It would simply hug the piston so tight that no force on Earth could move it. It wasn't a death sentence. It was a hydrostatic lock of metal on metal, a molecular bear hug. The parts changers saw a seized engine. The veteran saw a machine that had simply gone to sleep in a warm coat and woken up in a straitjacket. $300, the auctioneer yelled, losing patience. Do I hear 300 for the yard art? The veteran opened his eyes. He looked at the serial number plate again. 5J, the 5th series, the experimental batch. The crowd saw a disaster. He saw a savings account. The manual said you had to bore the cylinders out to fix this. The manual was written by engineers who needed to sell parts. The veteran knew that all this engine needed was to be reminded of the temperature where it was born. The young mechanics brought out a jump pack, a plastic box full of capacitors. They hooked it to the ancient 24-volt electrical system. They wanted to shock the heart. The solenoid hit the steel ring gear. A loud clack. Then a hum. The cable stiffened. The amps flowed, but the iron did not yield. The starter motor groaned, a sound of pure electrical resistance turning into heat. Bad starter, one kid said. No, the other replied. The starter is trying. The crank isn't letting it. They disconnected the clamps. Sparks flew. The smell of ozone mixed with the diesel fumes. She's welded, the leader said. He wiped his hands on a rag that was cleaner than the veteran's shirt. Pistons are rusted to the walls. You'd need a jackhammer to free that. The crowd nodded. It was the consensus of the day. The veteran cleared his throat slowly. It wasn't a loud sound, but in the quiet after the failed start, it carried. It isn't seized, he said. He didn't look at the boys. He looked at the exhaust manifold. It's sleeping. The auctioneer, perched on his podium on the back of a flatbed, leaned over his microphone. He was a man who sold speed, not history. Sleeping? He boomed. The speaker system crackled with feedback. You hear that, boys? The old-timer says she's just taking a nap. Maybe you should sing her a lullaby. Laughter rippled through the rain. It was a cold, sharp sound. The veteran didn't flinch. He walked closer to the track frame. He pointed a calloused finger at the seam where the cylinder head met the block. Look at the gasket line, he said softly. If she was rusted solid from rain down the stack, you'd see the weep. Iron oxide takes up more space than iron. It pushes out. It bleeds. There is no blood here. The mechanics looked closer. They saw only grease and mud. They didn't know how to read the absence of a stain. And the paint on the injector lines, the veteran continued. Caterpillar yellow, applied in Peoria in '58. Unbroken. If this engine had thrown a rod or spun a main bearing, someone would have cracked those lines to troubleshoot. Nobody has touched this fuel system since Eisenhower was in office. So it's magic then, the mechanic asked, smirking. It just decided to stop turning. Physics, the veteran corrected, not magic. Physics you didn't read about on a tablet. He knew what they couldn't see. The Ni-resist liners expanded differently than the cast iron block. When the engine shut down hot in freezing weather, the liners clamped down on the pistons. It wasn't rust. It was a shrink fit created by temperature differential. The auctioneer tapped his microphone. Well, Professor, if you're so sure it's just sleeping, why don't you pay for the bed? We're at 300. Put your money where your memory is. The veteran looked at the machine. He saw the potential energy stored in that interference fit. It wasn't broken. It was just holding its breath. It isn't scrap, he said, more to the iron than the men. Then bid, the auctioneer shouted. 300, going once. The auctioneer's voice was a flat line of boredom. The rain drummed a relentless cadence on the rusted hoods of the dead machines. The veteran raised a single, gloved hand. 400. The silence that followed was heavy. The auctioneer didn't even scan the crowd for a counteroffer. He slammed the gavel down with a wet thud. Sold! He walked to the clerk's trailer, his boots squelching in the mud. He counted out the bills slowly. 4 20s, then 5 10s, then the rest in 1s and 5s. It was grocery money. It was the heating oil fund for November. But as he handed the cash over, his hands were steady. Marcus was waiting by the flatbed truck, arms crossed. Marcus was a good neighbor, strong and willing. The veteran hooked the heavy chain to the towing eye. They winched the machine onto the bed. The truck suspension groaned. settling down onto the overload springs as the full weight of 1958 Peoria iron sat down. The drive home was a study in silence. Back at the shop, the chaotic noise of the auction was replaced by the reverent quiet of the workspace. The smell here was specific: old cutting fluid, dust, and the faint, sweet scent of diesel. He backed the truck in. The overhead chain hoist, a 2-ton Yale spur-geared block that had been hanging there since the 60s, rattled as he pulled the loop. Click-clack, click-clack. The sound was mechanical music. They pushed the D2 onto the heavy steel stands. It sat there, dripping rainwater onto the concrete, a massive, silent monolith. Marcus left with a shake of his head. The bay door rolled down, shutting out the world. The veteran was alone with the patient. The drive home had been a study in silence, the heavy iron behind the cab acting as a literal anchor to the past. But it wasn't until the shop door sealed him away from the rain and the mockery that the real conversation could begin. Not between men, but between a mechanic and the metal. He didn't grab the air impact gun. Pneumatic tools are for assembly. Disassembly requires the tactile feedback of hand tools. He took a long breaker bar and a 6-point socket. He started on the cylinder head nuts. Crack! The first one broke loose with a sharp report, like a pistol shot. That was the first victory. Rust doesn't snap. It crumbles and drags. A clean break meant the threads were dry. One by one, the nuts came off. He lifted the heavy cast iron head, bracing his legs against the weight. He expected to see the horror show the crowd had predicted. Cylinders pitted like the moon, brown sludge filling the bores, the tragic evidence of water intrusion. He saw nothing. The cylinder walls were bright. They shone with a dull, gray luster. There was no water. The oil in the valley was black and thick, but it was pure. The piston sat at mid-stroke, looking ready to run. He placed a wooden block on the number 1 piston and tapped it with a hammer. Thud. It felt solid, immovable, like striking the anvil itself. It defied the physics of the naked eye. Clean metal should move. But the veteran knew the invisible force holding it was stronger than rust. The shop was quiet, save for the rhythmic click of the ratchet. The veteran moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who isn't paid by the hour anymore. He wasn't tearing the engine down, he was undressing it. He removed the rocker arm assembly, laying the parts out on a clean rag in the exact order they came off. The push rods were straight. The valve tips showed almost no wear. He placed a magnet on the lifters and pulled them up. They slid out of their bores with a satisfying schloop, coated in oil that was black but slick. He reached down to the camshaft gear. With a gentle pressure of his thumb, he pushed. The gear rotated. Smooth. Silent. The cam lobes lifted and fell in their oil bath without a hitch. The crankshaft, when he reached through the inspection port, had a tiny amount of end play, just as the spec sheet required. The heart of the machine was free. The brain was free. Only the muscle, the pistons, was paralyzed. This was the first confirmation. A seized engine usually dies violently. A lack of oil welds the bearings to the crank journals. A dropped valve smashes the head and locks the piston at top dead center. But this was selective paralysis. It was a precision failure. The engine hadn't torn itself apart. It had simply decided to become a statue. He reached for the wooden box on the top shelf. He blew the dust off the lid. Inside lay a Starrett inside micrometer, the kind with the friction thimble that relied on the feel of the operator, not a digital readout. He lowered the anvil into the number 1 cylinder bore, careful not to scratch the wall. He rocked it gently, feeling for the high spot, listening for the faint scratch of the contact points. He read the vernier scale. 4 inches exactly. He moved the tool down an inch. 4 inches exactly. He checked for ovality. 0. The cylinder bore was perfect. It had no taper, no ridge at the top of the travel, no scoring. He grabbed a shop rag, soaked it in solvent, and scrubbed the top rim of the cylinder sleeve. The grime dissolved, revealing the metal beneath. There it was, a faint, almost invisible line where the insert met the block deck. And a stamp, smaller than a grain of rice. Ni. Nickel. He touched the stamp with one finger, tracing the letters. The cold grease of the shop seemed to evaporate. In its place came a heat he hadn't felt in decades. Not the gentle warmth of a wood stove, but the lung-searing, sulfur-thick air of the Peoria foundry. The smell of core wash, that acrid, biting scent of silica and binder, rushed back as if no time had passed at all. He could hear it now, the rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of the drop forges and the high-pitched scream of the honing machines on line 4. In its place came the heat, not the gentle warmth of a wood stove, but the oppressive, lung-searing heat of the Peoria foundry in July of 1958. He could smell the core wash, that acrid, biting scent of silica and binder that clings to your skin for days. He could hear the rhythmic, earth-shaking thud of the drop forges and the high-pitched scream of the honing machines on line 4. It was a Friday afternoon. He was 22, working quality control with a micrometer that cost a week's wages. The order had come down from the glass-walled offices upstairs. The export division needed the new Series 5 J blocks finished before the weekend. These weren't the standard domestic engines. These were the tropical specials, fitted with the experimental Nye-resist sleeves. The suits had sold them to a sugar plantation in Cuba, promising they would run forever in the corrosive sulfur dampness of the coast. The engineering theory was sound, the metallurgy was brilliant, but the suits didn't know about the honing stones. On line 4, the abrasive stones used to finish the cylinder walls were rated for 50 blocks. By Friday at 3 p.m., they had run 60. The stones were glazed, worn down by the incredibly hard nickel alloy. The operator, a man named Dutch who chewed unlit cigars, flagged it. "They're cutting tight," he had said, wiping grease from his forehead. "The bore is coming in at the bottom of the tolerance." The floor manager looked at the clock. He looked at the stack of unfinished blocks. He looked at the weekend waiting on the other side of the whistle. "Run 'em," he said. "If the gauge fits, it ships." So they ran them. The stones didn't cut the usual crosshatch pattern deep enough. They polished the metal instead of cutting it, leaving the bores smooth as glass and tight, right at the razor's edge of the specification. The veteran had stamped the inspection cards himself. 5J-1102 through 5J-1150. He remembered the feeling of the stamp biting into the fresh steel. Fast forward 6 months. January 1959. A bitter winter. 3 of those engines came back from a distributor in Minnesota who hadn't shipped them south yet. They had sat on a loading dock in 20 below weather. When the mechanics tried to prep them, the cranks wouldn't turn. "Seized," the paperwork said. "Warranty claim. Catastrophic failure." The engineers wanted to strip them down. They wanted to analyze the oil, X-ray the bearings, and fire the assembly crew. But Dutch had walked over to the frozen blocks. He didn't have a degree. He didn't have a clipboard. He had 40 years of touching iron. He laid his hand on the frost-covered head of the first unit. "It ain't broken," Dutch had grumbled. "It's just shivering." He dragged a salamander heater, one of those roaring kerosene jet heaters, over to the line. He aimed the blast at the block, not close enough to scorch the paint, but close enough to bathe it in hot air. The engineers laughed. They stood there with their slide rules, calculating torque loads, while Dutch just watched the metal. He waited until the block was warm to the touch, specifically until the spit on his finger sizzled and danced before evaporating. About 140 degrees. He put a bar on the crank. With one hand, effortlessly, he turned the engine over. The nickel sleeves, heated by the cast iron jacket, had expanded just enough to let go of the aluminum pistons. The interference fit vanished. The catastrophic failure was cured by hot air. They shipped those engines back out the next day. No service bulletin was ever written. No technical update was sent to the dealers. It was a floor secret, a trick known only to the men who stood in the heat that day. The manual didn't record it because the manual describes how the machine should work. It doesn't describe how the machine actually feels. The veteran opened his eyes. The rain was still drumming on the roof of his shop. The D2 sat before him, a survivor of that specific Friday afternoon shift. The memory faded, but the lesson remained. Dutch's trick wasn't in the service bulletins. It wasn't in the technical manuals that the young mechanics trusted with their careers. It was etched in the iron itself, waiting for someone who remembered how to listen. He didn't need a machine shop. He didn't need a boring bar. He needed a blue tin of kerosene and the very specific kind of patience that separates mechanics from parts changers. He did not reach for the shelf of aerosol cans. The solvents in those brightly colored cans were designed to break surface rust on a bolt, not to penetrate a molecular interference fit deep inside a cast iron block. He walked to the flammable cabinet and pulled out a square, dented tin. It was blue, heavy, and smelled of jet fuel and lantern light. Kerosene. Kerosene has a wetting ability that borders on the supernatural. It doesn't just sit, it creeps. It searches for the microscopic valleys in the metal. The veteran needed a fluid that could wait at the door of the interference fit, ready to rush in the moment the metal relaxed its grip by a millionth of an inch. He set the gallon can on the bench. Next came the heat. Cast iron is a brittle material. If you heat one spot too fast, the thermal shock will crack the casting faster than you can blink. He dragged the weed burner out from the corner. It was a long wand connected to a 20-pound propane tank, designed to scorch fence rows, not revive engines. But it threw a wide, soft flame. A blanket of heat, not a needle. He positioned it carefully, setting the nozzle 2 feet back from the block. He wasn't aiming at the cylinders directly. He was aiming at the air around them. The target temperature was critical, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. It sounds low. You drink coffee hotter than that. But in the world of metallurgy, 140 degrees is a threshold. It is the point where the crystalline structure of the nickel alloy begins to yawn. It is the temperature where the interference fit reverses itself. He lit the burner. The propane roared with a hollow, rushing sound. He adjusted the valve until the flame was a lazy blue tongue, licking the empty air near the engine block. Then, he waited. The veteran sat on a stool, watching the heat waves shimmy off the iron. 10 minutes. 20. The block began to sweat as the condensation evaporated. Then, the sounds began. Tick. It was a small sound, coming from deep inside the water jacket. Ping. That was the sound of stress relieving itself. The iron was expanding. It was breathing. The veteran moved the wand in a slow figure-8 pattern, keeping the heat moving, never letting it settle in one spot long enough to create a stress riser. The goal was to push the thermal energy deep into the core, past the water jackets, through the thick webs of the casting, and into the liners themselves. After 20 minutes, the heat radiating from the block could be felt from 3 feet away. The veteran shut the valve on the propane tank. The roar of the burner died instantly, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. He didn't wait. He grabbed the gallon tin of kerosene. The liquid sloshed heavily against the metal sides. He moved to the number 1 cylinder injector port, which stood open like a hungry mouth. He tilted the can. The clear, thin fluid poured out, a steady stream disappearing into the dark heart of the engine. When the kerosene hit the hot iron, it didn't just sit there. It hissed. It was a sharp, angry sound, the sound of a liquid flashing into vapor on contact. A plume of white smoke rose from the port, smelling of unburnt fuel and hot metal. The veteran kept pouring until the port was full, the fluid dancing and bubbling slightly as it absorbed the heat of the block. He moved to the second cylinder. Pour, hiss, smoke. The ritual was repeated. Now came the chemistry. He shined his pocket light down into the first port. The level of the kerosene was visible, a shimmering pool in the darkness. As he watched, the level dropped. It wasn't evaporating, it was diving. The heat had done its work. The interference fit had relaxed just enough to open a microscopic pathway between the piston rings and the cylinder wall. The kerosene, with its low surface tension, was hunting for that gap. It was wicking down into the seized area, drawn by capillary action, creeping between the metals like a liquid wedge. It was a chemical key finding the tumblers of a mechanical lock. "It's drinking," the veteran whispered. "It's leaking," Marcus countered, stepping closer. "No," the veteran corrected, not looking up. "It's traveling." The sun had begun to set outside, casting long, bruised shadows through the shop windows. The light turned orange, then gray, matching the iron. The tension in the room grew with the darkness. The veteran could still hear the auctioneer's laugh in his head, a looping track of ridicule. Scrap iron, boat anchor, fool. The money was gone. The reputation was on the line. If this didn't work, he was just an old man who burned $400 on a memory. He took off his heavy leather glove. He placed his bare hand flat on the valve cover. The metal was hot, biting into his palm. He held it there. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. At 130 degrees, you can hold it. At 150, you blister. This was right in the middle. The metal was exactly where it needed to be. He picked up the breaker bar. It was a 3/4 drive snap-on, solid steel, older than the mechanic holding it. He slotted the socket onto the crankshaft nut. He planted his feet, finding purchase on the concrete floor. He took a breath and tightened his grip on the steel handle. He planted his feet. The concrete floor was slick with condensation, but his boots held. He took a breath and began to lean. He didn't jerk the bar. Amateurs jerk. They rely on momentum because they don't trust their strength. The veteran trusted the physics. He applied a steady, linear force, loading the steel handle like a longbow. The bar flexed. A 1/4 inch of deflection. Then 1/2 inch. The socket groaned against the nut. The tension in the room rose with the curve of the steel. Marcus took a step back, his hands coming up instinctively to cover his face. He was waiting for the explosion. He was waiting for the bolt head to shear off and fly across the shop like a piece of shrapnel. In his mind, the engine was a solid block. Something had to break, and it was going to be the smallest part. But the veteran didn't stop. He pushed past the point of comfort. He pushed into the red zone of the metal's yield strength. His knuckles turned white. He closed his eyes, visualizing the microscopic layer of kerosene fighting the grip of the nickel alloy. Let go, he thought. Just let go. Crack! The sound was violent. It was a sharp, high-pitched report that cracked through the shop like a rifle shot. Marcus flinched so hard he hit the workbench behind him. "You snapped it!" he shouted, the vindication evident in his voice. "I told you! You sheared the crank snout right off!" The veteran didn't answer. He didn't let go of the bar. He opened his eyes and looked down. The handle was 6 inches lower than it had been a moment ago. He was still connected to the heart of the machine. "Look," he whispered. He pushed again. This time, there was no violence. There was a heavy, dragging sensation, the feeling of a massive weight being dragged through mud. Groan. The sound came from deep inside the casting, a resonant vibration of iron sliding against iron. The flywheel turned. The fan blades ticked forward. 1 inch. 2 inches. "It's moving," Marcus breathed. He walked forward. "It's actually moving." "She was just stuck in the doorway," the veteran grunted. He repositioned the socket. He pulled again. The resistance was fading. The kerosene had done its work. The bond of the interference fit was broken. Now it was just heavy parts moving in thick oil. He spun it a full 360 degrees. He stopped and pointed to the open injector ports. "She's crying." Marcus looked. Weeping from the spark plug holes was a gray sludge, a mixture of kerosene, old oil, and the microscopic dust of the cylinder walls. It bubbled out, purging the years of silence. The engine wasn't bleeding. It was clearing its throat. "Compression check," the veteran ordered. "Thumb." Marcus didn't argue this time. He placed his gloved thumb over the number 1 port. The veteran leaned on the bar. As the piston came up, the pressure built. Marcus pressed harder. Pfft! The air blasted past his seal with a sharp hiss. "That's 400 pounds, the veteran said, a rare smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The rings are free. The valves are seating. She's got lungs." Now came the blood. The veteran moved to the injection pump. He cracked the bleeder screws. He began to work the hand primer, a small brass plunger on the side of the transfer pump. Squish. Click. Squish. For a minute, there was nothing but the hiss of air. Then, the tone changed. The plunger got firm. A stream of red diesel, bright and clean, sputtered out of the bleeders. He tightened the screws. He cracked the injector lines at the head. He cranked the engine over with the bar again. Spurt. Spurt. 2 distinct pulses of fuel. The heart was beating. The timing was intact. He connected the batteries. 2 heavy-duty 12 volts wired in series. He clamped the cables onto the starter terminals. Sparks flew. The system was live. "Glow plugs," he said. He flipped the toggle switch. The ammeter on the dash buried itself to the left. 30 amps of current rushed into the pre-combustion chambers. Inside the head, Resistance wire glowed orange, preparing the nursery for the fire.
"Give her 20 seconds, the veteran said. "She's been cold a long time."
He placed his thumb on the heavy black starter button. The shop was silent. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling block and the hum of the current. The veteran looked at Marcus. "Stand back," he said softly. "If she wakes up angry, you don't want to be standing in front of the fan." He pressed the button. The solenoid engaged with a sharp metallic clack that echoed off the cinder block walls. Then came the groan. The 24-volt starter fought the compression, turning the heavy flywheel against the resistance of 40 years of silence. Chug, chug, chug. It was slow at first, the oil pump struggling to push the thick, cold sludge through the galleries. White smoke puffed from the stack, raw, unburnt kerosene and diesel vapor. It hung in the damp air like a ghost, stinging the eyes with the promise of combustion. Then, the sound changed. The chug became a bang. Cylinder number 1 fired. The block shuddered violently on the stands, shaking dust from the overhead lights. A perfect ring of black smoke shot up toward the rafters. Then number 2 hit. Bang! The rhythm stumbled, caught, and then, suddenly, it smoothed out. The chaotic noise of the starter was replaced by the deep, rhythmic thrum, thrum, thrum of a diesel engine finding its idle. The governor caught the rack, settling the speed to a steady 650 revolutions per minute. It wasn't just noise. To the veteran, it was a language. The tappets clicked a steady beat, loose but functional. The injection pump sang its high-pitched whine. The exhaust note was crisp, clearing from black to a hazy, heat-shimmering gray as the combustion chambers finally warmed up. The smell of the shop changed instantly from damp concrete to the rich, oily scent of horsepower. The vibration traveled through the floor, up through the soles of their boots. It was the heartbeat of Peoria, alive again. Marcus stood with his mouth slightly open, the empty coffee cup dangling from his hand. He looked from the spinning fan blades to the veteran, his skepticism evaporating in the diesel fumes. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The machine was speaking for him. The roller door rattled. A figure stood silhouetted against the gray evening light. It was the auctioneer. He had come to drop off the title, expecting to find a pile of parts and a humbled old man ready to beg for a refund. Instead, he walked into a cloud of exhaust and the undeniable sound of a running caterpillar. He stopped 3 feet from the bumper, his expensive jacket looking out of place in the haze. He watched the belt spinning. He listened to the lack of a knock, the lack of a skip. He looked at the seized engine that was now happily consuming fuel. He shouted over the noise. "You replaced the block?" The veteran shook his head. He reached over and throttled it down, letting the idle drop to a slow, confident lope. "Same block," he said. "Same pistons, same rings." The auctioneer walked around the machine, looking for the trick. He looked for the weld marks, the new gaskets, the evidence of a major overhaul. He found only the wet stain of kerosene around the injectors and the heat radiating from the iron. He looked at the veteran, really looked at him for the first time. The mockery was gone. In its place was a confused, grudging respect. It is the look a man gives a magician when he knows he has been tricked, but cannot find the wire. "It was locked solid," the auctioneer said, his voice smaller now. "My guys said it was welded. They used a 4-foot bar. It shouldn't be running." "Your guys read the manual," the veteran replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "The manual assumes the metal is dead. It assumes that if a part doesn't move, it's broken. It assumes the past is irrelevant." "And what do you assume?" "I assume it remembers," the veteran said. "This engine wasn't broken. It was just cold. It was built with a high nickel sleeve that shrinks when it freezes. It just needed to be reminded of the day it was born. It needed to be 140 degrees again. The metal told me the truth, while your scanner told you a lie." The auctioneer ran a hand over the fender. The vibration was steady. He pulled the title from his pocket and set it on the workbench, shaking his head. "We sold it for scrap price," he muttered. "You sold it for what you thought it was," the veteran corrected. "I bought it for what I knew it could be. That's the difference between a salesman and a mechanic. You see the rust. I see the reason." The auctioneer walked back out into the rain. The D2 rattled on, a testament to the things we discard because we have forgotten how to listen. Subscribe to the Forgotten Manual for the secrets the service manuals left out. Tell us in the comments about the machine only you know how to talk to.